Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. Shri Bhavani Shankaraya Namaha. Shri Matre Namaha. Om Dakshinasya Samarambha Shankaracharya Madhyama Asmadacharya Paryanta Smarya Guru Parampara Shruti Smriti Purananam Alayam Karunalayam Namami Bhagavat Padam Shankaralloka Shankaram Shankaram Shankaracharyam Keshavam Badarayanam Sutra Bhashya Kritau Vande Bhagavantau Punah Punah Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Bheda Vibhagine Vyomavad Vyapta Dehaya Dakshina Murtaye Namaha Parijnana Ashrama Shri Guru Shankara Parijnana Ashrama Shankara Sadguru Keshava Vamana Krishna Panduranga Ananda Parijnana Guru Sadyo Jata Shankara Sadguru Gurur Brahma Gurur Vishnu Gurur Devo Maheshwaraha Guru Sakshat Parabrahma Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahana Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Namaste. On behalf of Shri Chitrapur Mutt, I extend a very warm and a cordial welcome to you all to this live webcast of a presentation on the life journey of the 9th Mathadipati and Guru of Shri Chitrapur Mutt, Parama Pujya Shrimad Anandashram Swamiji, by Shri Chandavarkar Sai Maam from California, USA. It was but a few years back when one fine morning, Sai Maam suddenly felt a spontaneous upsurge of love and devotion for Parama Pujya Shrimad Anandashram Swamiji, which took him by surprise. It left a warm and a nourishing bond which he never lost. Something in his mind prompted him to ask himself how he could express his gratitude for this spontaneous upsurge. And he found his answer in sharing this love and devotion by preparing a presentation on Swamiji's life journey. Chandavarkar Sai Maam was born and raised in Kolkata. After finishing his graduation in commerce from Kolkata University, he joined Bangalore University for studies in law and subsequently graduated in law. In 1986, he migrated to USA and worked for over 30 years as a hospital compliance auditor for the Medicare program of the US federal government, from where he retired in December 2019. He now spends his time pursuing his passion for history, philosophy, and literature. He is also a meditation instructor and teaches in person as well as online. He and his wife Chitra live in Thousand Oaks, California. It has been just 58 years since Parama Pujya Shrimad Anandashram Swamiji shed his mortal coils and merged into the divine. This Guru and Master led the Chitrapur Samaj on its spiritual journey for more than half a century. With his calm countenance and mild and serene demeanor through many a turbulent path. Today, I invite Chandavarkar Sai Maam to reminisce this wonderful period of the golden years of bliss through his presentation. Over to you, Sai Maam.
Thank you very much for that nice introduction, Chaitanya Maam. I'm going to share my screen now and begin the presentation. So welcome everybody to today's presentation on stories from the life of Anandashram Swamiji. And before I actually start sharing the stories, I want to dwell for a few moments on the significance of hearing stories from his life. After that, we'll get to the stories itself and his immense contribution to the Guru Parampara. But that, of course, is just the beginning point, because then we want to know, as the Bhana Pleiadi, what was the secret of his success? What can we learn from his example and bring that to our lives, our individual everyday lives? Finally, I want to dwell on the road ahead. So we'll get to that, but let me first start with the significance of stories from the lives of all holy people. There are three reasons why we're sharing this today. One is it's an opportunity to honor the memory of Anandashram Swamiji, who played such a critical role in keeping the Bhana community together and united in very difficult times. But there's another reason. And the reason is that when you listen to stories from the lives of holy people who are like spiritual engines, dynamos, when you listen to events and anecdotes from their life, that listening itself is a spiritual practice. And finally, when they are in our hearts because of the stories that we listen to, we can learn from their example how to live our life with greater wisdom, greater peace, and some of the grace that they show in their lives. But I also have a personal reason, which I wanted to get to. And Chaitanya Maam in his introduction mentioned this briefly. I have had love and devotion for Anandashram Swamiji for decades now. And I would like, in today's sharing or today's presentation, I would like to light the lamp of love in your hearts, so that when we all walk away from today's presentation, not just stories that you will remember, it will be Anandashram Swamiji's presence in your heart and your love for the Guru and your love for the Mat that would uplift us all and give strength to our steps. In the Yoga Sutra, in the first chapter, there are a number of sutras that give us options on how to bring calmness to our lives, how to concentrate better. The sutra just before this one talks about focusing on the inner light within all of us. But it doesn't leave it at that, because it recognizes that everybody is different. And then Sutra 37 says that one more option of bringing concentration and calmness is meditate on the heart of an element soul. And what better way of meditating on the heart of an element soul is there than to listen to stories from their life? Before we begin and actually get to the stories, I want to do a brief meditation so that all of us can focus and center ourselves and prepare ourselves to listen to the story. So wherever you are, please sit erect. Make sure that you're stable and comfortable so that you can be still for a few moments with no physical movement. Gaze briefly at his image that you see on the screen. Now take that sense of his presence, your heart. That presence fills us peace and calmness. It attunes us to the grace of the Guru Parampara. That grace pervades our entire body. Our hearts are purified, and we are cleansed by that. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. So in listening to the stories, I want to start with the background before Anandashram Swamiji became the Buddha. At that point, the community was deeply divided. And there were many reasons for that. One reason was Bombay was coming up as a magnet for Bhanaps to get jobs. So they began a migration from the Canaras to the city of Bombay. That brought in some physical distance between the Canaras and Bombay. And as we all know, physical distance does strain bonds between people and institutions, or people and the people that are in their life. There was another factor in that in order to further their career chances or for success, many Bhanaps felt it was necessary to go to England for higher education and then come back and work. That too was a matter of physical distance, even more than being in Bombay. Being in England was on the other side of the world. Now, these two factors were of physical distance, and physical distance weakens the bonds, as we just mentioned. But there was one more factor, and that was more subtle. It was the fact that monotheistic Hindu reform faiths were beginning to grow in influence in all the major cities of India in those days. And many of the urban Bhanaps came under the influence of this ideology. So all these reasons were the drift of the community was to move away from loyalty to the mutt. It wasn't the entire community, it was part of it. That was what brought the division. All this pained Pandurangashram Swamiji very much. He was deeply pained by it. And he refused to, he declined to take a Shishya to continue the Guru Parampara. In May of 1915, his illness took a turn for the worse. As you can see in the photograph itself, the difference in his physical condition between the first photograph and the second makes it obvious that he was not doing well at all. Meanwhile, the elders were praying to God that Pandurangashram Swami may change his mind and that he may take a Shishya so that the Guru Parampara could continue and all of us would have access to the same spiritual guidance. But that didn't happen, but their prayers continued. And then everything changed on a morning. It was at 2 o'clock in the morning. Pandurangashram Swamiji had fever. He was frail. He was old. And he had a vision. The vision was of a sannyasi telling him to adopt a Shishya. He got up. Not completely, but partially. And he told the attendants who were there in his room, "Don't you see we have a visitor here? Why don't you take care of him? Bring some milk, give him a seat, let him be there. Let us take care of him." The attendants, because he had fever, thought he wasn't well and he needed to rest. And so they were pleading to Pandurangashram Swamiji to please rest because he wasn't well. So he did rest when they were pleading with him, but only for another 2 hours. At 4 o'clock that morning, he woke up again, and this time it was a complete waking up. He told the attendants, call the senior priests to his room because we have to make preparations for Shishya Svikar, which came like a bombshell to the people listening at that point. Senior priests arrived. He asked one of the senior priests, who happened to be Mangesh Bhatt Maam, can one of his sons be taken as the Shishya? And Mangesh Bhatt Maam declined. That changed everything in the space of a second. Pandurangashram Swamiji's tone changed. It was no longer a request now when he addressed Haridas Ramchandra Maam, who was the father of Anandashram Swamiji in his Purvashram, saying it was now a command. I want your son Shantamurti as the Shishya. And of course, it went through three stages of acceptance. First, the parents, first the father, then the mother, and finally of the young Shantamurti, who was only 13 years old in 1915. But things went through, all the stages were fulfilled. It moved forward, and it was decided that this would now be formal and Shishya Swikar would take place. But Pandurangashram Swami ji was hastening this entire process. He wanted it to take place very quickly. That itself created a problem. Because one of the important rituals in the transfer or the acceptance of a Shishya is the giving to the Shishya by the Guru a dand, which is the staff. And it's not just any staff. It has to be prepared from a special kind of a wood. There are worship rituals that go in. The whole point in those rituals is that physical staff or the danda becomes infused with the power of the Guru, and it stays with the Shishya throughout his life as a symbol of the Guru's blessings. In this photograph, you see here the same dand that was given to Anandashram Swamiji when he was taken on as a Shishya. It stays with the Swami forever. But the problem was this: it takes time to have that blessed and infused dand. It doesn't happen overnight. So where was the mutt going to get this danda from? If you don't have it, it's one of the most important rituals in the taking of a Shishya. What are we going to do? So everyone in the mutt was worried. At that point, Pandurangashram Swamiji suddenly remembered that when he was ordained as the Shishya, there were two dands that were prepared and had gone through the entire process of the Guru's blessings being infused in the dand. One, of course, was given to Pandurangashram Swamiji himself as the new incoming Shishya, but the other was stored in the mutt. But now, with just 1 or 2 days, how are you going to find that? And so the mutt staff were anxiously looking up at the ceiling to see where can they find in the ceiling this blessed dand. And then suddenly, there was a second miracle. From all the objects that were stored at the ceiling level, the dand that was blessed that many years ago when Pandurangashram Swamiji was taken on as the Shishya was attached to the ceiling by a twine or a slender rope. While they were looking up, that rope snapped and it fell into the hands, literally fell into the hands of the merch staff who were waiting, looking up to see where they could identify this thunder. Now, that miraculously solved the second obstacle that had come in. And from that point, things started moving forward very fast at blinding speed. Sannyasa Diksha was given, Shishya Swikar took place, and then 9 days later, Pandurangashram Swamiji took Mahasamadhi. It was all a disorienting speed of events. Here you see the young Anandashram Swamiji at 13 years old, Guru and Shishya together for a very brief period of 9 days. And then on June 14th, 1915 was the day when Pandurangashram Swamiji took Mahasamadhi. At that point, the 9-day-old Shishya Swami gave Tirtha and holy Bhagirathi water to his Guru, and then became the Matadipati. So in 1915 to 1927, which is a period of 12 years, was a very quiet period in Anandashram Swamiji's life. He was very young, he was 13, and he had this bereavement of losing his Guru in less than 2 weeks. So it was a point for him to focus on his studies, on growing in the spiritual life. And he was very lucky to meet a spiritual mentor, Krishnashram Saraswati ji from Rishikesh, who happened to be passing through Shirali at that point. and agreed to be Anandashram Swamiji's tutor. So there was much study that was going on. There was much focusing on learning. At that point, there were challenges that came his way as part of Mert administration, but it didn't affect the unfolding of his love. Gradually, but surely, his love and drawing people towards the Mert started unfolding even in those quiet years. But 12 years later, there was a quantum leap forward. There was a historic visit that Anandashram Swamiji made to Bombay in January of 1927. That is a kind of a watershed, because then it divides the periods. The quiet period ends and it suddenly changes to something else. So in January of that year, Anandashram Swamiji came to Bombay. And he was in Bombay only for 3 days. Just 3 brief days. But in those 3 days, all the barriers between the Mathadipati and the laity were broken. It was like a flood. The community gathered around the Guru, and all that love that had been held back in some way now came out in the open very rapidly. 3 days later, Anandashram Swamiji took the train with his retinue to go to North India. He was to go to New Delhi, stay there for a few days, and then move on to Rishikesh. So the train was to take him to New Delhi, and a lot of Anats came to the railway station to see him off. And it was a very moving situation. The Canara Saraswat wrote an editorial about that event, that when Anandashram Swamiji turned to get onto the train, there was not one single heart that did not want him to stay longer with them. Now, I bring that up to show that in 3 days, there was this complete turnaround in love and devotion. And now it was so obvious. When Anandashram Swamiji got to New Delhi, he stayed with Atangri Shankar Maam. And as they got into conversation, he did mention that the Mert was not doing well, that its financial prospects were difficult. And he just laid out the situation just the way it was. But Hatangri Shankar Maam's heart was deeply touched. Deeply touched. Immediately he felt that his role in life at this point was to jump in and do whatever he can for the Mert. That was 1927. 32 years go by. But they were great years. You see some of the statistics here, like Vantika collections more than doubled 5 years later. Sabhas were being formed in a large number of places, not just Bombay, outside of Bombay. In Bangalore, in the early 50s, which it was actually 1951, the Bangalore Mert was purchased by all the devotees getting together to create the Mert. I mean, the physical Mert. So as the decades go by, you can see the love and devotion of the laity was getting stronger and stronger. The pinnacle was in 1959, when Anandashram Swamiji decided to adopt Sishya to continue the Guru Parampara. It was a pinnacle because it was a sign of unity in the community and the Guru's faith in the future. In 1954, which is 4 or 5 years before the Shishya Svikar, I put in this photograph because it shows you the growing love of the community. He came to Bangalore. A cooperative housing society had been just set up, and he was invited to inaugurate it. It was named after him as the Anandashram housing society. And this was the welcoming committee that brought him in the car and took him there. 5 years later, in Bombay, came the Shishi Sweeper. You can see the intensity of the expression on the faces of the people surrounding him, wrapped with devotion to the Guru, walking along with the car on the way to Shivaji Park. And then Shishi Sweeper, and this is probably the most viewed, the most famous photograph for all Bhanams in our history of the Guru Parampara. The acceptance of Parigyanashram Swami as the incoming Shishya. I want to dwell now now that all these stories have come up, what made this immense success, this immense accomplishment in terms of bringing the community together? And when you look at these stories, there are three things that emerge. One was Anandashram Swamiji's holiness. As I mentioned before, when you're a spiritual engine or a spiritual dynamo, that holiness touches people's hearts and changes them not in a few days, changes them instantly. And that is the miraculous thing about it. But it comes when you have that high level of holiness. The second factor was, and this was something that everybody noticed and documented and wrote about, was the fact that there was an extraordinary degree of peace that was there in him, in his personality. He exuded this, he radiated this peace. Everybody wanted to participate in that because to be in his physical presence itself was calming and brought concentration. And finally, it was a fast-changing world. Anandashram Swamiji's wisdom about distilling the essentials from the non-essentials because of his insight into dharma and into spiritual life made it possible for him to modify the ancient faith for a changing world. So these were the three that I want to bring up some stories for all the three factors that made it possible for him to bring about these changes in the community. And I first want to bring up three stories about His Holiness. And they're all with different kinds of individuals. The first was at Hatangiri Gopal Maam, but this was when Hatangiri Gopal Maam was only 5 years old at the time, so a young child. The second was with two brothers who were unhappy with the mutt and had moved away from the mutt and stopped supporting the mutt, basically. So there's some degree of discomfort between them and the mutt. And finally, with somebody who had no connection with the mutt at all, a total stranger, in fact, a German engineer who happened to be working in telco. So I'll bring up these events to show that it doesn't seem to matter your stage in life. It doesn't seem to matter whether you're a bhana or a non-bhana. Anandashram Swamiji's holiness was such that it touched people's hearts instantly. So let me start with the one with Hatangiri Gopal Maam. So Anandashram Swamiji was there at his father's home in New Delhi in January of 1927. And Hatangiri Gopal Maam was born in December, 5 years before that. So he was maybe 5 years and a month when Anandashram Swamiji came there. And because his birthday was just 4 weeks before, or maybe a month before, he was given a new tricycle. And his father warned him very seriously, saying, "Don't you dare go anywhere near where the Guru's room is. Wherever you play, make sure that you stay within a certain, bounds. I don't want you to knock on his door and disturb him." And of course, Hatangiri Shankar Maam was known to be a very strict and a disciplinarian. So it did strike some fear in the 5-year-old boy. He was a 5-year-old boy. So he couldn't restrain himself. Took the tricycle, went to where he was not supposed to be, peeped into the room where Anandashram Swamiji was, and then was overcome by fear that he would be taken to task by his father. But meanwhile, events unfolded rapidly, and he was drawn into it. Anandashram Swamiji came, opened the door, He led him inside. He even picked up an apple that was next to his bedside and gave it to him. And the 5-year-old boy said, "Well, can I share the apple with you?" Um, then he picked him up. He sat him down on his lap and embraced Patangadi Gopal Mam, who was only, a 5-year-old kid at the time. Something happened in that moment. It was a huge beam of love that came out from Anandashram Swamiji, entered his heart. And it, as he wrote in an article in the birth centenary issue, it kindled in Patangadi Gopal Mam from that young and tender age of 5 an everlasting bond of devotion. He never lost it. And as you know, he has written seminal works that are now part of our community resources. You can always go back to them. The second anecdote I want to talk about was about what is now known as the Tambat brothers incident. It's there in 50 Years of Bliss. And essentially what happened in this was, because some families had moved away from the mart, the Tambat family was one of those families. But they were still part of the faith. And so Keshav Mam, who is one of the brothers, was a keen student of Bhagavad Gita. And somehow things worked where the two brothers, Keshav Mam and his, I think the younger brother, who were granted an interview with Anandashram Swamiji in the Bangalore mart, in Bangalore. There wasn't a mart at that point. And they got into a discussion, and Keshav Mam brought up, because of his study of the Gita, he brought up various questions. Does the Gita really apply to modern contemporary India, to modern life? And there was a discussion on some of the shlokas in the Gita. But something happened, like happened in the previous incident that I talked about. It wasn't just the discussion of a few things in the Gita, or what is the meaning of this, or what is the significance of this. That, of course, was there. But in that 1 hour or an hour and a half of a direct encounter with Anandashram Swamiji, their hearts were purified and cleansed right away. And there was great love that sprang up in them for the Guru and for the mart. A few weeks later, there was a large conference of Bhanaps to talk about mart affairs, and they were all assembled where they were gathering. And the two brothers came in, and they were known in the community as being uncomfortable with the mart. The two brothers came, prostrated themselves in front of the assembled Bhanaps there, begged forgiveness, and vowed to stay as strong supporters of the mart. It came to everybody as a revelation because it was completely unexpected. This was not on the cards at all, that somebody's heart would change completely and would go from being uncomfortable to being a very strong, committed devotee. The third story I have for you is with Anandashram Swamiji's interaction with Dr. Korsh, who happened to be the general manager of Telco at the time. And Kulkarni Vasant Mam at that point was a senior official in Telco. And he stayed with Kulkarni Vasant Mam, and a tour was arranged to take Anandashram Swamiji around the works. Initially, Vasant Mam approached the general manager, which is Dr. Korshan, and said, the Swamiji from our community is here. We would like to show him Telco because it's one of the prime examples of India moving forward as an industrial nation. Can you take him around? And Dr. Korshan had a reputation for being a somewhat brusque person, brusque, and he spoke his mind. Politeness was not one of his known qualities. So he refused right away. He said, I don't believe in bishops or saints or Swamijis or anything. I don't want anything to do with it. You can ask somebody else. So Vasant Mam asked the head of the foundry, Dr. Chakravarti, I think it was, to take Anandashram Swamiji around Telco. So that took place, and they were in the foundry maybe half an hour later when uh, uh, Dr. Chakravarti was showing him the foundry. And Dr. Pershan, who was the general manager, happened to be there because it was part of his routine to go through the works on a daily basis. And he saw this showing around that was going on. He walked up to Kulkarni Vasant Maam and said, Vasant, I know I refused to take your Swamiji around Telco, but I've changed my mind. Can I show him around the works? I've never seen a person of such radiance, of such magnetism. And of course, Vasant Maam said, definitely. And then it changed. Dr. Koshin himself escorted Anandashram Swamiji around Telco work. And at the end of that tour, he even prostrated before Anandashram Swamiji. Now, that's the third example I have of something that happens not even overnight. It happens because of an encounter. Your heart is changed completely. And where there was either indifference or maybe mild hostility or unconcern, now there is love and devotion. So I want to stop here for a very brief moment to talk about holiness. And it's hard to talk about holiness because it's a very abstract quality. It's hard to define beauty. But we know it and we see it. We know it from the impact that it has on us. It kindles love in our heart, which wasn't there before. It brings devotion, which was not there before, maybe. And it gives us a sense of spiritual well-being. And that too is an abstract word. But we know what it means to be physically well. You have that sense of vigor and lightness in your body. So spiritual well-being has its own feeling that we experience. When you experience that, you know you've been touched by holiness. I want to go now to something that Anandashram Swamiji was very famous for. And this was just the peace that he emanated, came out from him. Those who encountered him absorbed that peace. And it shows up in different ways of dealing with life. One was his ability to discuss difficult issues, or those which had a kind of a touch of something potentially confrontational. He would just lay out his position. There was no animus. There was no arguments. There was no opposition, an attempt to break down somebody's position. It was just a straight-cut presentation of a certain position without any of that heat. And that in itself touched people's hearts. We saw before when Anandashram Swamiji was at Hatangri Shankar Maam's place in New Delhi, an example of the difficult issue. There was a difficult issue in that the Chitrapur Mutt at that point in time was going through financial difficulty. But it wasn't as though there was any request for help. It wasn't as though he was trying to draw in people to help. It was just a straight cut presentation that there were difficulties and it was the sharing. But it's the kind of sharing that comes with that serenity and that detachment that goes to people's hearts. And so that was his approach to discussing difficult issues. It is something that we can all learn from. I mean, there's no shortage of confrontational situations to all of us in our lives, either at work or within the family or with the neighbors or anywhere. Now, in all those situations, if you can remember to take the animus out of it and to basically state a position, that is something that we can learn from the example of Anandashram Swamiji. The second thing was that despite the fact that there were great obstacles, it didn't shake his peace. And that was because of his incredibly strong faith in divine protection. The last thing I want to bring up that was known about Anandashram Swamiji from a lot of people, and I picked an example from an article that Benigal Sanjeev Maam wrote in 50 Years of Bliss. about how Anandashram Swamiji was able to do the little things of life with great care and attention. As part of his puja, for instance, one of the things is to wash the dand. That's part of the puja. And it may be there are other things in the puja which are of greater importance. This is one relatively minor part of the. But the fact that it was relatively minor versus the more important part of the puja didn't make a difference. This is something that Sanjeev Maam noticed, who happened to be watching the whole process. That even that, what was the minor part, was done with meticulous care, with great attention. And he was not in a hurry. Not that this had to be finished and he had to move on to something else, get it over with. That wasn't there at all. The whole atmosphere was one of calm concentration, doing even the little things of life with great attention. Those are all the things that generate peace. All these ways of approaching life generate peace. One last example I have on this issue was Dr. Frank Conlon, who was in Bombay at the time to do research on the history of Bhanaps. And in June of 1966, when he was there doing his research, he was lucky enough to get an interview with Anandashram Swamiji. And he, a couple of years ago, he did mention this in his talk. And his takeaway from that encounter with Anandashram Swamiji was that he was struck by his holiness, which we have already talked about. He had this ability to just impact people on first encounter, but he had a presence about it and the calmness that we were talking. So this is something that touches everybody who comes into contact with him. Now, when you get to peace and you take a moment to think about it, it is hard to define peace. Peace comes from an entire way of life, which we can see with the example of Anandashram Swamiji before us. It's a combination of having vigor and focus and determination, along with serenity and surrender, the divine will. When those two qualities are blended with a good balance, we can be peaceful and still be part of all the duties that are on our shoulders. The second thing is not to be in a hurry. That if there is complete absorption in the work of the moment. When I'm doing this presentation, for instance, to be completely absorbed is to follow the example of Anandashram Swami. No matter what you're doing, whether it's minor or it's major, you're completely absorbed. And the third and last factor which would generate peace in all our lives, again, going back to the example of Anandashram Swamiji and the entire Guru Parampara, is to have a contemplative discipline in our lives, no matter how busy it is. Those silent hours of prayer and meditation impact our daily life. Swamiji, Anandashram Swamiji, was able to distill the essentials from the non-essentials. And this incredible ability or clarity of insight into dharma gave him the ability to make changes as needed for a changing world. One important change that happened was the Rathotsav, the festival, the car festival, was suspended because it was absorbing a lot of expenses for the mutt, and the mutt wasn't in a financial position where this would have been, it would have endangered the financial future. So he took the unprecedented step of stopping the car festival or the Rathotsav and substituted it with the Sadhana Saptah, which was a 7-day period where there were all these spiritual practices for a whole week. Gayatri Jap, bhajans, kirtans, pravachans. It attained the same objective, which is to bring the community into active participation in spiritual practices under the umbrella of the mutt, under the protection of the mutt. The Rathotsav had the same objective to bring people and draw them into the family, the mutt family. And that was because there were other implications of the car festival. The Sadhana Saptah was introduced. Now, I bring that up to say that This is an instance of distilling the essentials from the non-essentials, focusing on what is the essential, meet an objective. The second thing was that Bhanaps were gradually becoming increasingly urbanized. They were now in the large cities of India, and this was in the mid 50s. Now, in the 21st century, they were all over the world. But at that point, there was something new that was happening, that it was no longer the Canaras. It was now the big cities of India. And you needed some medium to take dharma guidance into the homes of Bhanaps, wherever they were. And so the Chitrapur Sunbeam was launched in the first month of 1954. And I was lucky to get a copy of that very first. You might not be able to see it because the fonts, at least on the slides, are not that large, but it says here January 54. It's volume 1, number 1. So it's the very first Sunbeam that went out to Bhanap homes. And it was the vehicle or the medium for dharma guidance. That too was an innovation. The essential thing was not sitting in front of an audience and talking to them one-on-one, before, like used to happen in years before, because the community was now a diaspora. You needed written communication. That too was an innovation, distilling the essentials from the non-essentials. And I have some quotes here from the discourses of Anandashram Swamiji, which show once again this power to draw the essentials. He was always very emphatic on the fact that people should not push things beyond their powers. If something is excessive, it is not something that you can do on a consistent basis. You can do it one day, you can do it the second day, and after that you fall back because it's asking too much of you. So everybody has to make the judgment call, and he gave them this, that this was something legitimate. They need to do this because whatever they decide is, here are my limits, but I'm going to stay consistent within those limits. So this was a discourse that he gave back in December 1938, that dharma should be observed to the best of one's power. So we all have to make that judgment call. Where are those limits? And then keep those unchanged once you decide. You could always increase it, but it's the consistency and the steadiness that is important. One other point which he emphasized was emphasized as a spiritual practice, and also wanted to bring it up as not just something else, meaning there were important spiritual practices, and the chanting of the name of God was another one which didn't have the same authority. In fact, in this discourse, he quoted Adi Shankaracharya, who had declared on the authority of the Vedas, the Rig Veda, in this, that the repetition of the name, or what we call Namasmaran, was actually prescribed in the Vedas. And it is simple, but despite being very simple, it is superior to all other spiritual practices. So that was giving the community, life was getting busier and busier. This was one way which had scriptural sanction and scriptural encouragement, that the laity could pick this up and run with it, go forward with it. We've seen examples of where there was this distilling between the essentials and non-essentials. But there was also a line beyond which Anandashram Swami did not want to go. And that line was with the essential. You can see in this quote, in an address that he gave in 1942, that he said, if the community asks for reforms that are inconsistent with the essential requirements of dharma, you see, come back to the same principle. We are perfectly prepared to ask them, relieve us of this responsibility of being the Mathadip. So therefore, it reinforced the fact that, yes, we are making modifications to suit a changing world. There's some things that cannot be modified. And there was no going back at that point on these issues, on these dharma issues. I've shared the stories of the life of Anandashram Swamiji. I'm now at the point in the presentation where I want to focus a little bit on what is ahead of us. The main essential is that we need to strengthen our connection to the Guru and the Mutt, and there are ways to do it. One way is to use the technology that is available to all of us. It's never been there before, but we are in one sense, we are in the luckiest age because we can stay in New Zealand or be in Seattle or anywhere in the world, and we can still be remotely in connection with the Mutt. And there's a rich source of guidance that is there. So we need to stay connected with the Guru remotely. And even if you're in India, this remote connection is important to stay to watch his discourses, his Ashirvachans on the website, and to keep that constant contact no matter where you live, no matter where your physical presence is. We are very lucky to have an incredibly wonderful Mathadipati because he has in himself, he straddles two worlds. There's the contemporary world with it is very familiar and very conversant with. And there is the world of traditional dharma, which is equally conversant with. So the community is very lucky to have this Mathadipati in Chitrapur Mutt, where they can set up a bond right away because if they come from a contemporary background, unconnected to the Mutt, unconnected to dharma, or at least if not unconnected, loosely connected. So it is our good luck to have a Swamiji like him and technology which allows us to stay in remote touch. But technology by itself is never going to substitute being in the presence, being in the physical presence. So the second way to strengthen our connection to the Guru and the Guru Parampara and the entire tradition is to make visits to Sri Chitrapur Mutt in Shirali. Now, once again, go back to the thing about one's own power. We all need to make that judgment call. How often do we go? How long do we stay when we go there? But that is something that each family would decide for themselves. But it is important to keep that physical presence and physical connection going. Lastly, to keep that connection going at this point, we need to have study groups wherever you are in the world, within India or outside of India, where you can sit down and discuss and make a serious study of the Shastras. And we have access to the Guru's discourses. We have access to versions of the Shastras, and we have guidance. So what it takes is small groups of people who are very keen on learning more. That those three things would allow us to keep in touch with the Mutt and the Guru Parampara and to learn what we can from the guidance that is offered. Deepen our own spiritual practice, and that then begins to impact our daily life. So I'm at the end of what I had to share with everybody. So in conclusion, let us pray silently for a few seconds before we bring this presentation to an end. That the Guru's blessings, guidance, and protection be with us always. Over to you, Chaitanya Ma'am. I'm going to stop sharing now.
Thank you, Sai Ma'am, for your wonderful presentation. Truly, you took us back to the glorious days of the Samaja, basking in the glory of the Anugraha of Parama Puja Shrimad Anandashram Swamiji. I'm sure your presentation would have brought back fond memories, especially among the elders in our Samaj. Thank you once again. With this, we conclude with the Sabha Samapti Prarthana. Om Nandantu Sadaka Sarve Vinashyantu Vidushakaha Avastha Shambhavi Mestu Prasannostu Guru Sada सर्वे भवन्तु सुखिनः, सर्वे सन्तु निरामयाः, सर्वे भद्राणि पश्यन्तु, मा कश्चित् दुःखमाप्नुयात्। ओम शांति शांति शांति। ओम नमः पार्वती पतये, हर हर महादेव।